The radar screen flickered in the pre-dawn darkness of Nellie's Air Force Base, Nevada, and Senior Airman Marcus Webb leaned closer, squinting at something that shouldn't exist. The blip appeared for 3 seconds, vanished, then returned 40 miles north, a position no aircraft could reach that quickly. His coffee went cold in his hand as he watched the impossible track dance across restricted airspace, moving with the fluid grace of something that understood the sky better than physics allowed. Webb reached for the red phone connecting him to NORAD's Cheyenne Mountain Operations Center, his hand trembling slightly, because the transponder code bleeding through the static was one he'd seen only once before, in a classified briefing about pilots who never came home. The code belonged to Captain Dominika Ghost Rider Volkov, and according to every official record, every memorial service, every tearful family notification, she had died 5 years ago when her F-15E Strike Eagle went down over the Hindu Kush Mountains during a reconnaissance mission that was supposed to be routine. The wreckage was never found. The black box never recovered. The Air Force had presented her daughter with a folded flag and her squadron with a plaque bearing her call sign, and everyone moved on because that's what you do when the mountains take one of your own. But now that call sign was painting across military radar installations from Nevada to Colorado, and controllers were scrambling to understand whether they were tracking a ghost, a glitch, or something far more dangerous. Webb's supervisor, Major Linda Kozlov, appeared behind him with the rigid posture of someone who just received a call from very high up the chain of command. Her face was pale. "Lock down this facility," she said quietly. "Nobody talks about what they're seeing. Nobody." She stared at the radar track as it executed a tactical reversal that would have generated enough G-forces to black out most pilots. "Get me transcripts of any radio traffic on military frequencies, every channel, and find out who the hell is flying that aircraft." Because something was moving through American airspace with the precision of a seasoned combat pilot and the electronic signature of someone who'd been officially dead since 2020, and in the careful bureaucracy of military command, that combination meant one of two equally terrifying possibilities. Either someone had stolen a fighter jet and was using a dead pilot's credentials to avoid detection, or Ghost Rider had somehow survived, stayed hidden for 5 years, and was now announcing her return in the only language she'd ever truly spoken, the defiant poetry of high-performance flight. Webb pulled up the classified database, his security clearance barely sufficient for what he was accessing, and there she was. Captain Dominika Volkov, call sign Ghost Rider, born in Minsk but raised in Detroit after her family fled Belarus when she was 7. Her file read like mythology, top of her class at the Air Force Academy, the only pilot in her squadron who could land an F-15 with one engine and battle damage that should have made controlled flight impossible. A tactical mind so sharp her instructors initially suspected she was cheating, until they watched her dissect enemy radar patterns in real-time simulations with the casual brilliance of someone solving a crossword puzzle. She'd flown 63 combat missions before the Hindu Kush incident, earned 2 distinguished flying crosses, and had a reputation for bringing every member of her flight home no matter how bad the odds looked. Her weapons systems officer, Captain James Park, had survived the crash that supposedly killed her, pulled from a ravine by Afghan locals, and eventually evacuated by a Marine rescue team. His debrief had been classified, sealed so tightly that even Webb's supervisor couldn't access it without triggering alerts that would wake up generals. Park had left the Air Force 6 months after the incident, moved to Oregon, and according to informal reports, he refused to talk about Ghost Rider with anyone. Some trauma ran too deep for therapy or time to reach. The radar blip shifted course again, this time heading directly toward Nellie's with the purposeful trajectory of someone coming home. Webb's headset crackled with cross-chatter from tower controllers who were simultaneously tracking the contact and trying to figure out what protocols applied to someone who existed in their airspace but not in their reality. Unidentified aircraft, you are entering restricted military airspace. Identify yourself immediately. The tower controller broadcast on guard frequency, her voice professionally calm despite the situation's strangeness. Static answered her. Then, after a long pause that felt like the sky itself was holding its breath, a woman's voice emerged from the electromagnetic noise, accented, tired, but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone who'd learned to command attention in a cockpit where hesitation meant death. Nellie's tower, this is Ghost Rider requesting permission to enter the pattern. The simple transmission detonated through every command center monitoring the situation. In Cheyenne Mountain, analysts froze with coffee cups halfway to their lips. At Nellie's, Major Kozlov grabbed the edge of Webb's console hard enough to whiten her knuckles. At Langley Air Force Base in Virginia, where the 1st Fighter Wing maintained their operations center, a colonel who'd flown with Ghost Rider during her 3rd deployment felt his blood turn cold because he recognized that voice the way you recognize a melody from childhood. Instantly, completely, impossibly. The tower controller looked to her supervisor, who looked to Major Kozlov, who looked at the chain of command flowchart on her wall and realized there was no box on that chart labeled Procedure for Dead Pilots Requesting Landing Clearance. She made the only decision that made sense. Ghost Rider, Nellie's tower, you're cleared to enter left downwind for runway 21, report base leg. Her voice remained steady, professional, as if she welcomed ghosts every Tuesday morning. Acknowledge traffic pattern, advise fuel state and intentions. The response came quicker this time, and in the background, those who'd flown fighters could hear the subtle whistle of wind across a canopy and the muted thunder of a jet engine at cruise power. Nellie's tower, Ghost Rider copies left downwind for 2-1, fuel state is adequate, intentions are to land and explain everything. There was a pause, and then she added something that wasn't standard radio protocol but felt necessary. It's been a long time since I've been home. Webb zoomed the radar display and enhanced the return, trying to identify the aircraft type. The profile matched nothing in the active inventory perfectly, though it carried elements of an F-15's radar cross-section modified by something that blurred its edges, made it slippery to detection. Stealth characteristics grafted onto an airframe never designed for them. Whoever Ghost Rider was, wherever she'd been, she'd gotten her hands on technology that shouldn't exist outside of black budget programs that didn't officially exist themselves. Alert fighters were already scrambling from Nellie's, 2 F-22 Raptors launching with the urgent purpose of interceptors tasked with identifying a potential threat. Their pilots, Major Scott Reaper Morrison and Captain Angela Blade Chen, were among the best Nellie's had, experienced, calm under pressure, and trained to handle anything from Russian bombers probing Alaskan airspace to lost civilian aircraft wandering into areas they shouldn't. But neither had trained for this. Control, Reaper flight is airborne, request vectors to unidentified traffic, Morrison transmitted as his Raptor clawed for altitude, the Pratt & Whitney engines pushing him back into his seat with 22,000 pounds of thrust per engine. Reaper, turn heading 340, target is 20 miles, altitude Angels 30, heading 180, speed is 400 knots, the controller responded. Advise this target has identified as Ghost Rider, we have a situation here. Morrison keyed his mic twice to acknowledge, then switched to his flight's tactical frequency. Blade, you hearing this? Chen's voice came back dry, almost amused. Either someone's playing a sick joke or we're about to make first contact with the afterlife. Stay sharp. The Raptors accelerated, their advanced radar systems reaching out through the sky like electronic fingers searching for texture and detail. When they acquired the target, both pilots went silent for a moment. The aircraft ahead of them was definitely an F-15 Eagle variant, but modified extensively with conformal fuel tanks that didn't match any production model, and a sensor pod mounted on the centerline that looked hand-fabricated, almost artisanal in its complexity. Ghost Rider, this is Reaper flight, 2 F-22s on your 6 o'clock, 5 miles, Morrison transmitted on the common frequency. We're here to escort you in. Acknowledge. The response carried a hint of something that might have been a smile. Reaper Flight Ghost Rider acknowledges escort, appreciate the company, been flying alone for a while now. Morrison pulled his Raptor alongside the modified Eagle, closing to within 100 feet, and that's when he saw her through the canopy. The pilot's helmet was older model, scuffed and obviously well used, and even through the dark visor he could see her looking back at him with the steady gaze of someone who'd forgotten what fear felt like. She raised one gloved hand in a casual wave, the gesture so incongruous with the situation's intensity that Morrison almost laughed. Control, Reaper has visual on Ghost Rider. Aircraft appears to be a modified F-15 Echo model. Pilot is in the cockpit and responsive, he reported, keeping his voice neutral even as his mind raced through the implications. Requesting instructions. Major Kozlov had patched herself into the frequency by now, and her response came weighted with the authority of someone who'd just gotten off a call with a very stressed three-star general. Reaper, escort Ghost Rider to landing, maintain visual contact. Be advised we have emergency response teams standing by on the runway. She paused, choosing her next words carefully. Ghost Rider, welcome home. We have a lot of questions. Ghost Rider's response carried 5 years of exhaustion wrapped in steel. Ma'am, I have a lot of answers, some of them you're going to wish you hadn't heard. The 3 aircraft descended toward Nellie's in formation, the 2 sleek Raptors flanking the weathered Eagle like honor guards escorting a warrior queen back from exile. On the ground, fire trucks and ambulances positioned themselves along the runway, and security forces cordoned off the entire approach area because nobody knew if Ghost Rider was coming home as a hero, a prisoner, or something more complicated than either category allowed. Webb watched his radar screen as the formation entered the pattern, and he noticed something strange. The way Ghost Rider flew her aircraft showed none of the hesitation or rust you'd expect from someone who'd been out of the cockpit for 5 years. Every turn was silk smooth, every altitude correction precise, as if she'd been flying daily throughout her disappearance. Major Kozlov noticed it too. She's been practicing, she muttered to nobody in particular. Wherever she's been, she hasn't stopped flying. The tower controller's voice remained professionally calm as she guided the formation through their approach. Ghost Rider, you're cleared to land runway 21. Winds are 230 at 12 knots. Emergency equipment is standing by as a precaution. Ghost Rider acknowledged with 2 mic clicks, a pilot's shorthand for understanding without words. The modified Eagle descended through 2,000 feet, gear extending with mechanical precision, and Morrison and Chen maintained their positions until Ghost Rider was committed to landing, then broke off to orbit overhead as witnesses to history folding back on itself. The Eagle's wheels touched concrete with a puff of smoke, and Ghost Rider deployed her drag chute, the brilliant orange canopy blooming behind her aircraft like a flower, marking the end of a journey nobody understood yet. She taxied to the designated spot where security vehicles had formed a loose perimeter, and when her engines finally spooled down to silence, the entire base seemed to hold its breath. The canopy opened slowly, hinges protesting slightly, and Captain Dominika Volkov, call sign Ghost Rider, officially dead since 2020, emerged into the Nevada sunlight with the careful movements of someone whose body had learned hard lessons about survival. She was thinner than her service photos suggested. Her flight suit faded and patched in places with material that didn't match. And when she removed her helmet, her dark hair was longer than regulations allowed, tied back in a practical braid that spoke of places where military grooming standards mattered less than staying alive. Major Kozlov approached with 2 security officers flanking her, but she dismissed them with a gesture and walked forward alone. Some conversations required the intimacy of respect unmediated by protocol. Captain Volkov, she said simply, stopping 10 feet from the aircraft. Ghost Rider climbed down from the cockpit with practiced ease, and when she stood on the tarmac, she came to attention instinctively, years of training overriding whatever experiences had kept her away. Major, she responded, her accent slightly thicker than it had been in the old recordings. Captain Dominika Volkov reporting as ordered, though I acknowledge I'm considerably late. Kozlov studied the woman before her, the weathered face, the scars visible above her flight suit collar, the eyes that had seen things nobody should have to carry alone. You were declared killed in action, Captain. We buried you with honors. Your daughter accepted your flag. Ghost Rider's composure cracked slightly at the mention of her daughter, but she rebuilt it quickly. I know, ma'am. I watched the memorial service on grainy internet video from a cafe in Dushanbe. It seemed like the proper thing to do, attend my own funeral, even virtually. The questions multiplied faster than answers could contain them, spreading through the command structure like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. By the time Ghost Rider was escorted into a secure debriefing room inside Nellie's classified operations facility, half the Pentagon knew her call sign had come back from the dead, and the other half was busy drafting contingency plans for situations they didn't have names for yet. The debriefing room was deliberately neutral: gray walls, a metal table, uncomfortable chairs designed to encourage honesty through physical discomfort. But someone had brought decent coffee, which Ghost Rider accepted with the gratitude of someone who'd survived on worse for a very long time. Across the table sat Major Kozlov, a JAG officer whose name badge read Thompson, and a man in civilian clothes who introduced himself only as Richardson and carried the quiet authority of intelligence community management. Ghost Rider wrapped her hands around the coffee cup and waited, because she knew how these conversations worked. You let them ask their questions first, establish their framework, then you dismantle it with truth they aren't prepared to hear. Richardson opened a thin folder containing what looked like satellite imagery and placed it carefully on the table. Captain Volkov, let's start with the basics. What happened 5 years ago over the Hindu Kush? Ghost Rider took a sip of coffee, buying time to organize thoughts she'd rehearsed 1,000 times but never spoken aloud to anyone who could understand them. We were flying reconnaissance on a reported Taliban ammunition depot, standard mission profile, weapons systems officer Captain Park and myself. Halfway through the run, we took fire. Not the usual small arms or even RPGs, but a surface-to-air missile system that shouldn't have been there. Chinese HQ-9 derivative if my assessment was correct. She paused, remembering the cockpit alarm system screaming their warnings. I tried to evade, but the missile was already inside our turn radius. It detonated close enough to shred the starboard engine and damage hydraulics. I gave Park the order to eject, made sure his seat fired clean, then tried to save the aircraft. Her voice went flat, emotionless, the tone pilots use when discussing moments that still wake them at 3 in the morning. I didn't make it. The aircraft hit the mountain doing 300 knots in a controlled crash that should have killed me instantly. But death had proven surprisingly negotiable when Ghost Rider pulled herself from the wreckage with 3 cracked ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and the crystal-clear understanding that she was alone in enemy territory with no survival radio because the crash had destroyed it. She'd evaded the Taliban fighters who came searching for the downed American pilot, moving at night through terrain that existed in the merciless space between cliffs and sky, and when she finally found a village willing to hide her, she'd made a decision that would define the next 5 years. I couldn't call for rescue, she told the 3 people across the table. The Taliban knew an American pilot had survived. They were offering bounties, and any rescue attempt would have endangered both the team coming for me and the villagers hiding me. So I stayed quiet, let myself be declared dead, and started figuring out how to actually be useful while I waited for a chance to come home that wouldn't get innocent people killed. Richardson leaned forward, his expression carefully neutral. Captain, you're telling us you spent 5 years in Afghanistan without contacting American forces, survived in hostile territory, and somehow acquired a modified F-15 Strike Eagle that you just flew into Nevada airspace. You understand how that sounds? Ghost Rider met his eyes with the flat stare of someone who'd stopped caring about how things sounded when she was eating stale bread in a stone house, while Taliban fighters searched the valley below. Mr. Richardson, I understand exactly how it sounds. which is why I'm going to tell you where I've been, what I've been doing, and why that aircraft sitting on your runway represents intelligence that's going to change how you think about clandestine operations in Central Asia. But first, I need you to understand something. I didn't abandon my post, I didn't go rogue, and I sure as hell didn't turn traitor. I survived, I adapted, and I found a way to keep serving even when everyone thought I was dead. The debriefing lasted 8 hours, interrupted only by bathroom breaks and sandwiches that Ghost Rider ate mechanically, while describing a half-decade of existence in the shadowy margins between official militaries and the insurgent groups that controlled most of Afghanistan's mountain regions. She'd survived initially through the kindness of a village elder named Ramatullah, who'd lost his own daughter to a Taliban bombing, and saw in Ghost Rider an opportunity to strike back against the fighters who destroyed his family. He hid her, taught her passable Pashto, and introduced her to a network of resistance fighters who still opposed the Taliban despite the American withdrawal and the nominal peace agreements that everyone knew were temporary. They called me the Ghost because I moved at night and never stayed long in one place, Ghost Rider explained, her voice steady despite the obvious exhaustion. Initially, I was just surviving, but after a few months I realized I could do more than hide. I could gather intelligence, coordinate resistance operations, and most importantly, I could track the weapons flowing into the region from external sponsors. She described how she'd noticed patterns in the sophisticated equipment appearing in Taliban hands: Chinese missile systems, Russian night vision gear, Iranian communication networks, and realized she was watching a proxy conflict unfold where outside powers tested their technology against American countermeasures using Afghan fighters as experimental subjects. I started documenting everything, tracking serial numbers, photographing installations, and passing information to resistance groups who could disrupt the supply chains. But I knew that eventually, I'd need to bring this intelligence home to people who could actually do something with it on a strategic level. The modified F-15 had come from Pakistan, acquired through a contact in the ISI who operated in the profitable gray zone between official intelligence work and personal entrepreneurship. The aircraft had been one of several sold to Pakistan decades earlier, officially retired from service, but maintained in a classified facility near Peshawar by mechanics who understood that old fighters never truly died as long as someone needed them. I convinced them I was a mercenary pilot working for a private military contractor, paid them with funds from captured Taliban weapons caches, and spent 6 months getting that aircraft combat ready, Ghost Rider said, and even Thompson, the JAG officer whose job required professional skepticism, couldn't hide his incredulity. "You're telling us you purchased and refurbished a fighter jet using stolen Taliban money while pretending to be a mercenary," Ghost Rider shrugged. "When you put it that way, it sounds reckless, but the alternative was staying dead and watching everything I'd learned go to waste. I needed to come home, needed to deliver the intelligence I'd gathered, and I sure as hell wasn't going to walk across the border and hitchhike to the nearest embassy. So I did what pilots do. I found an aircraft and I flew it." Richardson studied her with the calculating expression of someone reassessing threat matrices. "And the technology modifications. The stealth characteristics we detected, those aren't standard F-15 capabilities." Ghost Rider's expression turned grim. "No, they're not. I found those components in a Chinese weapons depot outside Kandahar, part of a technology transfer program where Beijing was providing selective upgrades to Taliban equipment in exchange for testing data. I couldn't bring the entire system back, but I could install enough of it on my aircraft to demonstrate what we're facing." "Mr. Richardson, the Chinese are using Afghanistan as a laboratory for developing countermeasures to American air superiority, and I have 3 hard drives full of technical specifications that your engineers are going to want to see." The room went very quiet as the implications crystallized. This wasn't just a survival story about a pilot who'd endured against impossible odds. It was an intelligence windfall wrapped in a resurrection that would require institutional acknowledgement of failure and adaptation in equal measure. Major Kozlov broke the silence with the question everyone was thinking. Captain, why didn't you make contact sooner? 5 years is a long time to stay dark, even with hostile forces hunting you. Ghost Rider's hands tightened around her now cold coffee cup, and for the first time, genuine pain crossed her face. Because every time I was close to establishing secure communication, someone died. Rahmatullah died when Taliban fighters raided his village looking for the American ghost they'd heard rumors about. 3 resistance fighters who helped me died in an ambush that was too well coordinated to be accidental. A journalist who agreed to carry a message to the embassy in Kabul died in a car bombing 2 days later. Every time I tried to reach out, the message got intercepted and someone paid the price. She looked at each of them in turn. So I stopped trying to send messages and focused on staying alive long enough to deliver the intelligence in person. I know what it cost. I missed 5 years of my daughter's life. I let my parents believe I was dead. I abandoned my squadron. But those were the choices available, and I made the one that kept the most people alive while achieving the mission objective. Richardson closed his folder with a decisive snap. Captain Volkov, what you're describing is either the most elaborate unauthorized intelligence operation in modern military history or the most creative cover story for activities we haven't uncovered yet. We're going to need time to verify your information, contact everyone you've mentioned, and cross-reference your intelligence against existing sources. Ghost Rider had expected this. The institutional skepticism, the careful verification, the unspoken suspicion that survival might equal collaboration. I understand, sir. I'll cooperate fully with any investigation, submit to any polygraph or psychological evaluation you require, and I'll hand over every piece of intelligence I've gathered. But I need you to understand one thing. I'm not asking for exoneration or praise or even recognition. I'm asking you to take what I've brought you seriously, because people are going to die if you don't. She stood up, the movement carrying military bearing despite exhaustion and 5 years of irregular meals. I'm also requesting permission to visit my daughter, if that's possible under whatever classified protocol you're operating under now. She's 11 years old, she thinks her mother died a hero, and I need to figure out how to explain that her mother chose to stay dead for 5 years to protect people she'd never meet. The 3 officers exchanged glances, a silent conversation about regulations and compassion and the uncomfortable space where they collided. Major Kozlov nodded slowly. We'll arrange something, Captain. But first, you need medical evaluation, psychological screening, and a secure place to rest while we process everything you've told us. You've been running for 5 years. You can stop now. Ghost Rider's shoulders sagged slightly, as if permission to stop running had lifted a weight she'd carried so long she'd forgotten its pressure. Thank you, ma'am. And for what it's worth, I know this is complicated. I know I've created problems that are going to cascade through every level of command, but I'd do it all again if it meant bringing this intelligence home. She moved toward the door, then paused. One more thing, Captain Park, my weapons systems officer. He pulled me out of enough tight situations that I owe him the truth about what happened after the crash. If possible, I'd like to explain to him personally why I never made contact. Richardson made a note. We'll see what we can arrange, Captain. Welcome back from the dead. The news broke in controlled waves through classified channels first, then inevitably leaked to journalists who specialized in military affairs and had enough contacts inside the Pentagon to piece together fragments of the impossible story. By the 3rd day after Ghost Rider's return, cable news networks were running segments about the pilot who came back from the dead, though most of the actual details remained classified, and the footage they showed was limited to file photos from before her disappearance. The public narrative focused on survival and heroism, because that's what made sense to people who'd never flown at 30,000 feet or navigated the moral complexity of asymmetric warfare. But inside military aviation communities, the reaction was more nuanced. at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base in North Carolina, where Ghost Rider had been stationed before her final deployment. Her old squadron mates gathered in the bar they'd always claimed as their own and drank to the memory of a pilot whose ghost had apparently learned to fly. Some felt betrayed that she'd stayed hidden. Others understood the impossible calculus of survival in enemy territory. Most simply wanted to know if the woman who came back was still the same pilot who'd left, or if 5 years of survival had changed her into someone they wouldn't recognize. Major Derek "Hammer" Walsh, who'd flown wing for Ghost Rider on 27 missions, raised his glass in a toast that captured the mood. To Ghost Rider, who apparently took her call sign way too literally. May she forgive us for believing she was actually dead, and may we forgive her for proving us wrong. They drank in silence, each wrestling with the strange grief of unburying someone you'd already mourned. At Nellie's, Ghost Rider underwent medical screening that revealed the accumulated cost of her disappearance. Healed fractures from the crash, poorly set bones that had mended without proper medical care, vitamin deficiencies, dental work that desperately needed professional attention. The doctors cataloged it all with the clinical detachment of professionals documenting evidence, but their eyes carried something softer, recognition that bodies keep score even when minds try to forget. The psychologist assigned to her evaluation, a major named Dr. Sarah Chen who specialized in trauma and resilience, spent 3 days probing the emotional architecture Ghost Rider had built to survive. You understand that what you experienced, the isolation, the constant danger, the moral burden of staying hidden while your family grieved, those are conditions that typically produce significant psychological damage, Dr. Chen said carefully, pen poised over her evaluation form. Ghost Rider considered this from the chair where she sat with military posture despite the invitation to relax. Doctor, with respect, I understand that I should be more damaged than I am. I've had 5 years to think about the decisions I made and their consequences, and I've accepted that I'll carry guilt and doubt for the rest of my life. But I also know that I survived when I shouldn't have, that I turned survival into something useful, and that I'm sitting here now instead of being bones in an Afghan mountain. So yes, I have psychological damage, but I also have perspective that most people never gain. Dr. Chen made a note. That's a remarkably healthy integration of trauma and resilience. Most people in your situation would be presenting with severe PTSD, attachment disorders, or depressive symptoms. Ghost Rider's expression suggested she wasn't telling the whole truth, just the version that would get her through the evaluation. I didn't say I don't have nightmares, doctor. I just said I've accepted the cost of my choices. There's a difference. The evaluation continued, probing memories and reactions, testing for the psychological fractures that trauma leaves like fault lines through the architecture of personality. Ghost Rider answered honestly because she understood that deception would only delay the inevitable, but she also knew how to present strength alongside vulnerability, competence alongside uncertainty. She'd spent 5 years negotiating with warlords, resistance fighters, and arms dealers who would kill her if they sensed weakness. She could handle a psychological evaluation. Dr. Chen eventually closed her notebook with the satisfied expression of someone who'd found what they were looking for. Captain Volkov, my assessment is that you're experiencing situational stress and adjustment difficulties consistent with prolonged isolation in hostile environments, but you don't meet criteria for any disqualifying psychological conditions. I'm recommending continued monitoring and counseling support, but you're cleared for return to duty pending command approval. Ghost Rider felt something release in her chest, tension she hadn't realized she was holding. Return to duty meant validation, meant the Air Force saw her as a pilot first and a complication second. Thank you, Doctor. I appreciate your professionalism. Dr. Chen smiled slightly. Captain, between us, off the record, what you did was either incredibly brave or incredibly reckless, and I suspect the answer is both. Don't waste the second chance you fought so hard to earn. Ghost Rider stood, came to attention, and offered a salute that carried 5 years of exhaustion and determination in equal measure. I don't plan to, ma'am. The meeting with Captain James Park happened in a conference room at Nellie's, arranged with the careful choreography of people managing potentially explosive emotional situations. Park had flown in from Oregon reluctantly, still carrying the shadows of a crash that had defined the last 5 years of his life. He'd put on weight since leaving the Air Force, his face rounder and softer than Ghost Rider remembered, but his eyes still carried the sharp awareness of someone trained to process information at supersonic speeds. When she entered the room, he stood instinctively, old habits asserting themselves, and they regarded each other across 6 feet of distance that felt like miles. "Dom," he said finally, using the nickname her squadron had given her when military formality seemed insufficient. "They told me you were alive, but I didn't believe it until right now." Ghost Rider managed a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Park, I'm sorry for what I put you through. I watched your rescue footage online when I finally found reliable internet. You looked like hell." He barked a laugh that sounded more like pain than humor. "I looked like hell. Dom, you died. I watched the ejection sequence, saw your aircraft go down, and I spent 6 months in therapy trying to process the fact that I survived while my pilot didn't. You don't get to criticize how I looked." The anger in his voice was real, but underneath it ran currents of relief and confusion, and something that might have been joy fighting through 5 years of grief. Ghost Rider nodded, accepting the anger as her due. "You're right. I'm sorry. I know what my disappearance cost you, and I know that apology isn't sufficient, but it's what I have." She gestured to the chairs. "Will you let me explain?" They sat, and Ghost Rider walked through the same story she'd told Major Kozlov and Richardson, but this time she added the personal details. How she'd thought about Park during the worst moments, wondered if he blamed himself for the crash, hoped he'd found peace in whatever life he'd built after leaving the Air Force. Park listened without interrupting, his weapons systems officer training kicking in as he processed data and looked for patterns. When she finished, he sat in silence for a long moment. "You should have died in that crash," he said finally. "The fact that you didn't, that you survived and then chose to stay hidden instead of trying to come home immediately. I don't know if that's courage or something darker." Ghost Rider met his eyes steadily. "It was survival, Park. Not the heroic kind they teach you about in training, but the messy, complicated kind where every choice is bad and you pick the one that seems least likely to get more people killed. I'm not asking you to forgive me or understand. I'm just asking you to believe that I did the best I could with the options I had." Park's expression softened slightly. "I believe you, Dom. I don't like it. I'm angry as hell about it, but I believe you. You were always the most stubborn pilot I ever flew with. Made sense that you'd be stubborn about dying too." He leaned back in his chair. "For what it's worth, I'm glad you're alive. I'm glad you made it home. And I hope whatever you brought back with you was worth the cost, because the cost was pretty damn high." Ghost Rider felt tears threatening for the first time since her return, but she blinked them back. "It was worth it, Park. I brought back intelligence that's going to save lives, technology assessments that will give us advantages we didn't have, and networks we can use to track hostile actors in Central Asia. It doesn't balance the scales, doesn't make everything okay, but it means something." The intelligence Ghost Rider brought back proved as valuable as she'd promised. The 3 hard drives she'd carried in her modified F-15 contained technical specifications for Chinese stealth technology developments, assessment reports on Russian electronic warfare capabilities being field-tested in Afghanistan, Iranian communication encryption protocols, and detailed maps of weapon supply routes that had evolved since the American withdrawal. Defense Intelligence Agency analysts spent weeks cross-referencing her information against existing intelligence, and with each verification, their assessment of Ghost Rider shifted from skeptical to astonished. She'd conducted a 5-year single-operator intelligence collection mission that rivaled efforts by entire agency departments. The modified stealth components she'd installed on her aircraft became the subject of intense technical study. Engineers at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio examined the radar-absorbent materials and concluded they represented a developmental leap beyond what intelligence estimates had credited to Chinese aerospace research. This isn't just incremental improvement, one engineer reported to his superiors. This is a fundamental rethinking of how to defeat fire control radar in the X-band frequencies we use for air-to-air engagement. If this technology proliferates, our current generation fighters are going to have significant detection disadvantages. The implications cascaded through defense planning offices like falling dominoes. Budget requests were revised, training protocols updated, and somewhere in the classified depths of the Pentagon, strategic planners began gaming out scenarios where American air superiority couldn't be assumed as a given. Ghost Rider had brought back more than intelligence. She brought back a warning that the technological edge America had dominated with for decades was eroding faster than anyone outside classified briefings understood. Meanwhile, the personal dimension of her return remained complex and painful in ways that classified documents couldn't capture. Her daughter, Alina, now 11 years old and living with Ghost Rider's parents in Detroit, knew only that her mother had died a hero, and that life meant learning to exist around that central absence. Major Kozlov arranged the reunion with the careful deliberation of someone defusing an emotional bomb, setting it for a private room at Travis Air Force Base in California, where Alina and Ghost Rider's parents could fly in without media attention. Ghost Rider waited in that room with her heart hammering like it never had in combat, because facing enemy fighters was simple compared to explaining to your daughter why you chose to stay dead for 5 years. When the door opened and Alina walked in, taller than Ghost Rider remembered, dark hair in a ponytail, her father's eyes looking out from her mother's face, time seemed to fold back on itself. Alina stopped in the doorway, staring at the woman in the flight suit who couldn't possibly be real, and Ghost Rider saw the exact moment recognition collided with impossibility. "Mom!" The word came out small, questioning, weighted with 5 years of grief that hadn't finished processing before confusion displaced it. Ghost Rider moved forward slowly, giving Alina space to process what was happening. "Hi, sweetheart. I know this doesn't make sense, I know you have questions, and I know I owe you explanations for things that are going to be hard to understand. But yes, it's me, it's really me, and I'm so sorry I've been gone." Alina looked to her grandmother, Ghost Rider's mother, Irina, who nodded encouragement, and then Alina crossed the space between them in a rush and wrapped her arms around her mother with the desperate strength of someone afraid that letting go meant another disappearance. They held each other while Alina cried and Ghost Rider whispered apologies and promises in Russian and English mixed together. The languages of her childhood and her career blending like her identities had always blended. Immigrant child and fighter pilot, daughter and mother, the person she'd been, and the person 5 years of survival had made her. Irina and Ghost Rider's father, Victor, hung back initially, giving Alina and their daughter space for a reunion that defied every expectation except the fundamental human need for family to be whole. Eventually, Victor approached and placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder, and when Ghost Rider turned to look at him, his weathered face was streaming tears. "Damika," he said, using her full name in the Russian pronunciation that carried memories of childhood and the small apartment in Detroit where they'd built American lives from Belarusian beginnings. "We buried you. We said prayers. We thought." His voice broke and Ghost Rider pulled him into the embrace with Alina still holding on, the 3 generations forming a knot of connection that time and distance and institutional declarations of death hadn't managed to sever. Irina joined them, and for long minutes, they simply existed together in the wordless space where family didn't require explanation. Eventually, they separated enough to sit, and Ghost Rider faced the hardest briefing of her career, explaining to her daughter why staying dead had seemed like the right choice. She kept it age-appropriate, focusing on safety and difficult decisions rather than the tactical complexity and moral calculus that actually governed her choices. "Sometimes, when you're in danger and other people could get hurt if bad people find you, you have to be very quiet and very careful," she said, holding Alina's hands. "I wanted to come home every single day, wanted to call you and tell you I was okay, but I couldn't do that without putting you and other people in danger." Alina processed this with the serious expression of a child forced to grow up faster than childhood should require. "So you stayed hidden to protect us?" Ghost Rider nodded. "Yes, sweetheart. And to finish a mission, to bring back information that could help keep other families safe. It doesn't make it okay that I missed 5 years of your life. Doesn't erase the hurt I caused, but it's the truth. I chose the mission because I thought it was the right thing to do, and I understand if you're angry at me for that choice." Alina was quiet for a long moment, and then she asked the question that cut deeper than any tactical assessment. "Did you want to stay dead? Was it easier than being my mom?" The question landed like ordnance in Ghost Rider's chest, and she squeezed her daughter's hands tighter. "No, Alina, no. Being your mom was the hardest thing to give up, the thing I thought about every single day I was gone. There were nights when I almost broke, almost tried to make contact even though I knew it was dangerous, because missing you hurt more than anything else I experienced. I didn't want to stay dead. I had to stay dead until I could come home safely, and sweetheart, I know that's not good enough, but it's all I have." Alina studied her mother's face like she was memorizing features she'd thought she'd never see again, and then she nodded slowly. "Okay, I don't understand all of it, and I'm really mad that you were gone, but I'm glad you're back now. Can you stay this time?" Ghost Rider felt something break open in her chest, 5 years of professional composure cracking to reveal the mother underneath the pilot. "Yes, baby, I can stay now. I'm home for good." The path back to active duty was neither quick nor simple, requiring Ghost Rider to navigate the bureaucratic labyrinth of a military organization that had already processed her death and wasn't designed to reverse that particular transaction efficiently. Her rank remained captain. She'd technically been frozen at that grade when declared killed in action, but her seniority date and service record required extensive review. The Air Force convened a special board to evaluate her conduct, her intelligence-gathering activities, and most importantly, whether her unauthorized 5-year absence constituted desertion or something the military justice system lacked adequate vocabulary to describe. The board met at Randolph Air Force Base in Texas, convening in a secure conference room where 3 generals, 2 colonels, and a JAG officer reviewed hundreds of pages of documentation and testimony. Ghost Rider testified for 6 hours, answering questions that ranged from technical details about her modified aircraft to philosophical inquiries about duty and moral obligation. General Patricia Hammond, a 3-star who'd spent her career in intelligence before rising to command positions, asked the question that had haunted Ghost Rider since her return. "Captain Volkov, at any point during your 5 years in Afghanistan and Pakistan, did you consider that your duty as an Air Force officer required you to make contact with American forces regardless of the risks to yourself or others?" Ghost Rider met the general's eyes without flinching. "Ma'am, I considered it constantly. Every morning I weighed duty against pragmatism, orders against outcomes, and what I was supposed to do against what I could actually accomplish. I concluded that my duty extended beyond following procedure to achieving mission success, and that meant staying operational until I could deliver actionable intelligence rather than dying heroically or getting rescued in a way that compromised networks I'd developed." She paused, choosing her next words carefully because they would likely define how history remembered her. "I know that's not what they teach at the academy. I know regulations don't include a subsection about when to fake your death to continue intelligence operations. But ma'am, with respect, regulations are written for normal circumstances, and nothing about my situation was normal. I made the best choices I could with the information available, and I stand by those choices even knowing they'll be controversial." General Hammond exchanged glances with her fellow board members, and Ghost Rider couldn't read the decision in their faces. "Captain, your actions constitute the most irregular operational conduct I've encountered in 35 years of service. You violated protocols, disregarded chain of command, and put your family through unnecessary grief. You also conducted an intelligence operation that multiple agencies have confirmed provided critical strategic advantage, demonstrated resourcefulness that bordered on miraculous, and survived circumstances that should have killed you multiple times over. The general leaned back in her chair. This board finds that your actions, while extraordinary and outside normal procedural bounds, were conducted with mission success as your primary objective, and resulted in significant intelligence value to United States security interests. We do not find your conduct to constitute desertion or dereliction of duty. However, we are recommending a formal letter of reprimand for failure to establish communication with appropriate authorities in a timely manner, and we're requiring you to undergo an extended evaluation period before returning to unrestricted flight status. Ghost Rider's shoulders released tension she'd held since the board convened. Thank you, ma'am. I accept the board's findings and recommendations. General Hammond wasn't finished. Captain, off the record, you scared the hell out of this institution. We're designed to handle many things, but pilots who refuse to stay dead aren't among them. You're being given a second chance specifically because the intelligence you provided has strategic value, and because your conduct, however irregular, appears motivated by mission accomplishment rather than personal gain or malicious intent. Don't waste this opportunity. Ghost Rider came to attention. I won't, ma'am. You have my word. The board adjourned, and Ghost Rider walked out of the conference room into Texas sunlight that felt like absolution. The letter of reprimand would go in her permanent file, a permanent footnote to her career that would complicate future promotions and assignments. But she was still a pilot, still an officer, still part of the Air Force that had been her identity since she'd first looked up at contrails as a child in Detroit, and decided that she wanted to be the person making those lines across the sky. News of the board's decision rippled through the aviation community with mixed reactions. Some saw Ghost Rider as a hero who transcended bureaucracy to serve a higher purpose. Others viewed her as a dangerous precedent, a pilot who'd put personal judgment above institutional authority. Most fell somewhere in between, recognizing that combat and survival existed in moral territories that peacetime regulations couldn't adequately map. At Nellie's, Major Morrison and Captain Chen, the F-22 pilots who'd escorted Ghost Rider to landing, bought drinks for their squadron mates and offered a toast that captured the complexity. To Ghost Rider, who taught us that call signs sometimes become prophecies, may we never have to learn that lesson ourselves. They drank to duty and survival, to following orders and breaking them when necessary, to the uncomfortable space where heroism and recklessness share the same coordinates. Ghost Rider's return to flight status came gradually, beginning with simulator evaluations where she demonstrated that 5 years away from Western aircraft hadn't diminished her skills. Her performance in the sim impressed evaluators who'd expected rust and hesitation, but instead found a pilot whose instincts had been honed rather